Deep dive. Today, we're tackling one of the slipperiest questions in global affairs. Why do nations build these massive, sometimes really cumbersome international organizations, like the UN?
Well, the standard answer, the one you'd get in a textbook, comes from what we call rationalist theories.
Okay.
The idea is that states are just cold, self-interested calculators.
Yeah.
They only build institutions when it gives them a tangible, short-term benefit. It's all about strategic calculation.
But if that's the whole picture, then why do we see institutions that seem designed to do the complete opposite? I mean, why build these sprawling universal organizations where states have to accept, a high level of vulnerability, at least temporarily?
Right, exactly. You're placing your fate in the hands of dozens of other actors. It doesn't seem very rational on the surface. So our source material for today, a really fascinating analysis on this, argues we need to move beyond hegemony, look past that cold calculation, and get into the world of fundamental belief. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to try to understand that belief system. We'll define two very distinct concepts of trust and show how the sort of ideological struggle between them literally shaped two monumental institutions, the League of Nations and the United Nations. So the puzzle we're really trying to solve for you is this. Does global cooperation rest on a simple cost-benefit analysis or on something deeper, a moral, almost ideological belief in the, inherent integrity of others?
And that difference calculation versus moral belief, that's the whole game. So let's start by defining those two core concepts of trust, because they're absolutely not interchangeable. Okay, let's start with the one most people probably know, especially if you follow global politics. Strategic trust. This is the rationalist framework, what drives it. Strategic trust is purely informational. It's trust based on having enough information about another actor's intentions, and this is the crucial part, the structure of the situation they're in.
So you don't actually trust the person or the country?
No, you trust the system that constrains them.
Okay, so the mechanism is what? Like an anticipated reciprocal exchange. I cooperate today because I'm pretty certain you'll return the favor tomorrow because it's in your interest to do so.
Precisely. And because of that, this kind of trust is very contextual, it's fragile. It only really exists in situations where states have a concrete, measurable self-interest in keeping the relationship going.
The minute the costs change or the information shifts,
that trust just evaporates.
So at the end of the day, strategic trust is just pure risk management. You're mitigating the risk of someone defecting or taking advantage of you. I'm not trusting your goodness. I'm trusting your self-interest. You won't stab me in the back because you want the next thing I have to offer. That is the traditional view. Now, we have to shift gears pretty dramatically to the second type, generalized trust.
Ah, okay. This is where we really leave the world of contracts and get into ideology and psychology.
Generalized trust is so interesting because it's the belief that others are, generally moral. They're honest. They're not exploitative. Regardless of the immediate situation, it just takes the context right out of it.
It's fundamentally an attribute you assign to other people, to other countries. It's based on attributing honesty and benevolence to them. And what's so critical is that it's not based on intel reports or calculating utility. It's an embedded belief system.
Wait a minute, that sounds incredibly high risk. I mean, if you're operating on generalized trust, are you just being naive? Why would any rational state leader assume others are inherently good?
That is the central puzzle our source material is really digging into. Because generalized trusters are more likely to cooperate even in situations where the cold calculators or rationalists would predict defection.
Why?
Because they expect others to reciprocate, not out of fear of punishment or for the next reward, but because of a shared moral obligation, a sense of duty to the group or the goal. This belief structure gives them a kind of political courage to take risks.
Wow, that's a huge intellectual pivot. It moves international relations from a giant game of chess to something almost spiritual.
It does. And if you connect this difference in belief to the bigger picture, it starts to explain why states choose radically different blueprints when they're designing institutions.
These two beliefs dictate preferences for how you build things.
Exactly. So if you are driven by strategic trust, your design choices are pretty clear.
Meaning?
You prefer institutions that are smaller, more exclusive, or maybe highly hierarchical. Because monitoring is everything. A smaller membership makes it easier to see who might defect, and a hierarchy gives you clear, centralized enforcement. You can verify compliance.
And this is where we get that requirement for specific reciprocity, the direct short-term exchange, the quid pro quo.
Precisely. You give me X today, I have to give you Y tomorrow.
Yeah.
It's very transactional, The rationalist demands these concrete guarantees and clear enforcement because fundamentally they're managing their own inherent distrust.
Okay, so now let's shift to the generalized trusters. Their blueprint must look completely different.
Completely. They favor what the source material calls qualitative multilateralism.
Which means bigger is better.
Basically, yes. They want the largest possible membership universal, if possible, and they design systems built on flexible, long-term commitment.
And they require diffuse reciprocity. This is that non-transactional element we talked about, right?
It is. Diffuse reciprocity is this general sense of obligation to the group. You are not requiring a specific immediate payback for every good deed you do.
So you contribute now, trusting that you'll get some kind of benefit from the collective over time, but in a non-specified way, like funding a public good.
Yes, and that brings us to that paradox you mentioned. The generalized truster is willing to be vulnerable, to potentially lose out in the short term because they fundamentally believe their partners will honor their commitments in the long run. They're comfortable with that risk for the sake of the collective goal.
And this isn't just abstract political science, this clash of ideologies. It exploded for real in 1919 with the debate over the League of Nations.
The League of Nations was the ultimate experiment in generalized trust, wasn't it? Championed by President Woodrow Wilson.
Absolutely. His vision wasn't about specific treaties or transactional deals. It was a moral crusade.
Wilson saw the League's collective security system as a moral obligation. He used words like covenant and almost sacred agreement. He expected partners to commit morally, unconditionally. His goal was universal participation, the very definition of qualitative multilateralism.
He was trying to completely transcend that old, messy system of balance of power alliances. He wanted, and I think this is a quote, all nations to unite to act in the common interest.
Which required giving up a degree of sovereignty. And Wilson just wasn't worried about entrapment because his generalized trust told him that others would honor their ethical commitments.
But waiting in the wings for him was some very fierce opposition.
Yes, led by Republican figures like Senator Henry Cabot Lodge.
Yeah.
And these were classic conservative internationalists. They were
Yeah.
driven entirely by strategic distrust.
And their fears were, they were primal for any sovereign nation. They sound familiar even today. They were intensely worried about entrapment.
The risk of being dragged into conflicts in some faraway land that had nothing to do with U.S. national interest simply because a covenant told them they had to.
So they demanded specific reservations, ironclad withdrawal clauses, anything to protect U.S. sovereignty. Lodge had that famous line that just sums up the entire rationalist mindset. He said, "We must deal with human nature as it is and not as it ought to be." That is the strategic trust position in a single sentence. You cannot rely on moral hopes. You have to rely on guarantees. So the political fight wasn't just about party politics. It was a deep ideological struggle. You had the Democrats, under Wilson, in the generalized trust camp.
Willing to risk vulnerability for this collective dream.
And the Republicans, under Lodge, in the strategic trust camp, demanding institutional checks and specific reciprocity before they would ever commit.
And in that case, the strategic distrusters won. Lodge's opposition, forcing all those reservations and ultimately leading to the U.S. never joining. It just showed the immense power of that rationalist mindset. And then history came along and delivered the most spectacular and horrific confirmation of the rationalists' worst fears, World War II. That cataclysm seemed to prove the conservative critics right. Generalized trust suffered a devastating, almost fatal blow. So when planning began for the United Nations, the shadow of the League's failure, its lack of enforcement, its toothless universality, it just loomed over every single discussion.
And yet, the planners of the UN, who were mostly from FDR's administration, they still held on to that Wilsonian idealism. They were still pushing for qualitative multilateralism, for collective security, for diffuse reciprocity.
But they knew they couldn't succeed without bringing the strategic distrusters on board, both at home and internationally.
And this is why the UN's design is so fascinating, isn't it? It's a forced blend, a pragmatic compromise.
It really is. The overall framework is expansive, it's multilateral, it's very Wilsonian, it rests on generalized trust principles, but it has these crucial features built in specifically to satisfy the deepest fears of the strategic distrusters. And that brings us to the most defining, and I guess most controversial element of the whole thing, the veto power. The veto. That was the ultimate strategic guarantee. It was the absolute concession to the rationalist mindset, and it was championed at home by key conservative internationalists, like the Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg.
Right. Vandenberg was profoundly skeptical about relying on the moral goodness of other nations, especially the Soviet Union.
He saw the veto as a necessary shield. He needed an institutional guarantee that the U.S. could never be forced into an action it didn't want. It guarantees sovereignty protection.
For the strategic truster, it removes that fear of being entangled or obstructed. If your national interest is on the line, you have the unilateral power to just stop the whole collective.
Vandenberg had that great line. He argued, the veto guaranteed the continuance of the American flag over the Capitol. He was demanding that his nation's fate not be placed entirely in the hands of others.
It's amazing how that ideological split played out politically. The Democrats were mostly unified behind this trust-based, expansive vision for the UN, but the Republicans were the indispensable swing vote.
And they demanded those hard, non-negotiable provisions like the veto that reduced their exposure to vulnerability. The UN was ultimately created because the generalized trusters were pragmatic. They recognized that for this thing to survive, it had to contain the mechanisms of strategic distrust.
So it needed an ideological engine to get it moving, but a rationalist emergency brake to keep it from flying off the rails.
That's a great way to put it.
So when you look back, it seems pretty clear that these huge international organizations are not purely rational things. They're not born from some, efficient calculation of utility. They are the result of this huge political and ideological struggle.
A struggle between those who believe the world is fundamentally trustworthy and those who operate solely on cold, hard self-interest.
So if we boil this all down, generalized trust provides the social capital, I guess, the willingness to accept vulnerability that makes large-scale multilateralism even possible.
Right. Rationalism on its own just leads to small, tight monitoring groups. It can't explain the existence of a system as big and non-hierarchical as the UN. Generalized trust provides the aspiration, even if the final design has to include those strategic safety valves, like the veto, just to survive the inevitable distrust.
It reminds us that to get the deepest forms of cooperation, you have to move beyond a simple transactional view. You have to engage with a real commitment to believe in your partners, even if that belief has to be, buttressed by a few guarantees. Which leaves us with a final, and I think pretty important question for you to think about as you go about your day. If that core generalized trust is what creates the political space for broad qualitative multilateralism, what does the erosion of that fundamental trust we're seeing today, both between nations and within them, what does that imply for the future design and the effectiveness of organizations like the UN?
That's the question. If every nation falls back to only strategic calculation, can true risk-accepting multilateralism even survive at all?
What if the biggest deals in world politics, everything from trade to war, don't actually hinge on power or money, but on something, a lot more human? In this explainer, we're going to dig into Brian Rathbun's research, which points to one hidden ingredient that absolutely has to be there before nations can even begin to truly cooperate.
It really is one of the biggest questions in international relations, right? In a world full of competitors, why on earth would they ever choose to work together on really tough stuff like security or trade or climate change? It kind of goes against the grain.
For decades, the standard answer has been pretty straightforward. Countries just don't trust each other. It's not in their nature. So, the thinking goes, they build these big institutions, like the UN or the WTO, to basically act as a referee. They set rules, they watch for cheaters, and they enforce the deal. The whole point is to manage that natural distrust.
Okay, but this is where the research we're looking at gets really interesting. It poses a pretty radical question. What if we've got the cause and effect completely backward? What if trust isn't the product of these institutions, but it's actually the essential raw material you need to even build them in the first place?
So let's just quickly break down that traditional view. It's often called rationalism, and it basically sees the world as this giant, high-stakes chess match. Every country is just trying to get an advantage and, most importantly, make sure they don't get played for a fool.
And this is the exact idea this whole theory is designed to challenge. It says that if we're only looking at power and national self-interest, we are missing the real story. To understand why we get the global systems we do, we have to look inside the minds of the leaders themselves, at their deepest beliefs about human nature.
And to do that, we have to get really clear about what we mean by trust, because it turns out there's more than one kind. This theory pulls from social psychology to lay out two very, very different types. First up, you've got strategic trust. Think of this as the trust but verify approach. This has nothing to do with warm, fuzzy feelings. It is a cold, hard calculation. You trust another country to hold up its end of the bargain only because you've seen the evidence and you've concluded it's in their best interest to do so. It's a trust that's born from skepticism.
And then you have something completely different: generalized trust. This is not a calculation at all. It's a worldview. It's a baseline assumption that other people, and by extension other countries, are basically decent and will act in good faith. It's about being willing to cooperate first because you're optimistic about how others will respond.
Let's just put them side by side because this is so important. Strategic trust, that's all based on information, and its goal is just to manage risk. Generalized trust, that's based on belief, and its goal is to actually make cooperation possible. One is deeply skeptical, the other is fundamentally optimistic. And that difference, right there, is the key to everything else.
All right, now let's see how this plays out in the real world. We're going to start with one of the most ambitious and, let's face it, tragic experiments in global politics: the League of Nations, created right after World War I. At the very center of this whole project was the U.S. President, Woodrow Wilson. And this quote from a private letter tells you everything you need to know about his worldview. Wilson was the ultimate believer in generalized trust. He just assumed that the inherent goodness of people would win out in the end. His entire vision for the League was built on that optimistic foundation.
But Wilson's grand vision ran into a brick wall named Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge was the absolute embodiment of deep skepticism. He was the voice of strategic trust. For him, you don't make policy based on what people should be, you make it to protect yourself from what people are: self-interested, flawed, and not always reliable.
And look at this. This chart just lays out the clash perfectly. You can see how their two worldviews led to two totally different plans for the League. Wilson, coming from that place of generalized trust, wanted automatic security and binding moral promises. Lodge, the strategic truster, demanded escape hatches for every scenario. Congress had to approve war. National sovereignty was paramount, and you needed an easy way to get out. They weren't just debating policy details. They were having a fundamental fight about human nature.
Now, of course, we all know how that story ended. The U.S. never joined the League, and the whole thing collapsed, failing to stop World War II. So when the world got together to try again with the United Nations, the ghost of that failure was hanging over everything.
Yeah, the idealists had their shot, and a lot of people felt it led straight to disaster. The mood in 1945 was way more sober, way more realistic. The people designing the UN knew they couldn't just build it on hopes and dreams. It had to work in a world where you absolutely could not always trust your neighbor. What they came up with was this brilliant, if messy, hybrid. The UN still has that big, ambitious Wilsonian vision. That's the generalized trust part. But, and this is a huge but, it also has the Security Council veto. The veto is the ultimate strategic trust safety net. It guarantees that no major power can be dragged into something against its will. It's basically Henry Cabot Lodge's skepticism written right into the DNA of Woodrow Wilson's dream. So, after looking at all this, what's the big idea? What's the major takeaway here? It really comes down to the core argument of this whole analysis. And here it is, that crucial reversal. We tend to think that nations build institutions to create trust. But what this research powerfully argues is that it's the other way around. The kind of trust leaders already have in their heads determines what kind of institution they're willing to build. It's like this invisible operating system running in the background, shaping the entire architecture of our world. And that kind of leaves us with a really powerful thought for where we are today. As we face all these new global challenges, maybe the most important question isn't about the fine print of a treaty or the structure of an organization. Maybe it all comes down to something much simpler. What do we fundamentally believe about each other? Because what we can build tomorrow seems to depend entirely on that answer.